When Arthur spent his life savings on a collapsing rat-infested barn in Vermont, his neighbors laughed. They called it the biggest mistake of his life. But those laughs turned into stunned silence when a rotting floorboard gave way, revealing a forgotten subterranean vault that would rewrite local history entirely. Arthur Davies was not a foolish man by nature, but grief has a funny way of scrambling a person's common sense. At 58 years old, Arthur was a retired high school history teacher and a recent widower. After his wife, Helen, passed away from a sudden illness, the silence in their suburban New Jersey home became suffocating. He needed a project. He needed a distraction. Most importantly, he needed a place where the memories wouldn't ambush him in the hallway. That desperation led him to the rural, tight-knit community of Oak Haven, Vermont, and directly to a local property auction that would soon make him the laughingstock of the county. The property in question was the old Cobb estate, though estate was a generous term. It consisted of 2 acres of overgrown weeds and a massive 19th-century barn that looked like a stiff wind would reduce it to kindling. The roof sagged like a broken spine, the cedar shingles were curled and rotting, and the once red paint had long since peeled away to reveal gray, splintered timber. The original farmhouse had burned down in the 1970s, leaving only the barn as a monument to neglect. On the morning of the auction, the local townsfolk gathered mostly for entertainment. Among them was Richard Lawson, a wealthy, aggressive local real estate developer who made his fortune buying up distressed properties, flattening them, and building identical, soulless subdivisions. Richard had his eye on the Cobb land solely for the acreage. The auctioneer started the bidding at a meager $10,000. Richard Lawson lazily raised his paddle. "Let's get this over with," he muttered to his associates, expecting no contest for a plot of land featuring a hazardous waste site of a barn. "15,000, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the crisp autumn air. Heads snapped around. Locals eyed the stranger in the worn corduroy jacket. Richard Lawson smirked, clearly amused by the out-of-towner's ignorance. 20,000, Richard countered, purely to test the water. 45,000, Arthur shot back immediately, pouring the entirety of his remaining retirement savings and his late wife's life insurance into a single, impulsive bid. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. Richard Lawson lowered his paddle, letting out a sharp bark of laughter. "It's all yours, buddy," Richard sneered loudly enough for the whole crowd to hear. "I hope you budgeted for a bulldozer, because that's all that junk pile is good for." The gavel fell. Arthur Davies was the proud owner of the biggest eyesore in Oak Haven. The mockery began almost instantly. When Arthur visited the local diner, conversations would abruptly halt, replaced by poorly concealed snickers. He became known as the Fool of Oak Haven. Even his own sister, Margaret, called him in tears from New York. "Arthur, what have you done?" she pleaded over the phone. "You spent everything on a collapsing shed? You don't know the first thing about structural restoration. Please, sell it to that developer for a loss and come home." "I can fix it, Maggie," Arthur insisted, staring up at the gaping holes in the barn's roof. "It has good bones. I just need to clear out the junk." But the reality of the purchase soon set in, and it was brutal. The late Elias Cobb had been a notorious hoarder. For the first month, Arthur worked 14-hour days just hauling away decades of garbage. He dragged out rusted tractor parts, mountains of soggy, molded newspapers dating back to the 1940s, shattered glass, and enough raccoon droppings to fill a dump truck. His body ached in ways he didn't know were possible. His hands were blistered and cut. Every dollar he had left was bleeding away into dumpster rental fees and basic supplies. One afternoon in late September, Arthur walked into Henderson's Hardware to buy a new crowbar and some heavy-duty trash bags. Bill Henderson, the owner, rang him up with a look of profound pity. "You know, Artie," Bill said gently, leaning over the counter, "Richard Lawson was in here yesterday. Says his offer still stands. He'll give you 20 grand for the lot. It's a bitter pill, I know, but it's better than bankrupting yourself over a pile of termite food." Arthur tightened his jaw, grabbing his bags. "The barn stays, Bill. It's going to be a beautiful workshop. You'll see." But as Arthur drove back to the property, the bravado faded. He pulled his truck up to the barn and just stared at it. The sky was darkening with the threat of an early autumn storm. He was exhausted, lonely, and practically penniless. As the first cold drops of rain hit his windshield, Arthur buried his face in his hands and wept. The town was right. Margaret was right. He had made a catastrophic mistake, blinded by his own grief. He was a fool. Wiping his eyes, he stepped out of the truck and grabbed his tools. He couldn't afford to quit now. He had nowhere else to go. October arrived in Oakhaven with a vengeance. The temperature plummeted, and a relentless driving rainstorm hammered the region for 3 straight days. Arthur was inside the barn, fighting a losing battle against the elements. The wind howled through the gaps in the timber, and water poured through a dozen different leaks in the roof, turning the dirt floor into a muddy quagmire. He had rigged up heavy-duty halogen work lights powered by a noisy gasoline generator, casting long, eerie shadows against the cavernous walls. He was trying to secure a massive blue tarp over a section of the roof from the inside, standing precariously on an old wooden ladder. As he strained to hook a bungee cord around a crossbeam, his foot slipped. Arthur tumbled backward, hitting the ground hard. His heavy steel pry bar, which had been resting on the ladder, clattered down after him. The heavy steel tool struck the floor with tremendous force, but instead of the dull, wet thud of metal hitting packed dirt, a strange sound echoed through the barn. Clang! Voom! Arthur froze, wincing as he rubbed his bruised shoulder. He stared at the spot where the pry bar had fallen. He crawled over to it, grabbing the heavy metal bar. Deliberately, he raised it and struck the ground again. Voom! A deep, hollow reverberation. It felt as though the floor beneath him was vibrating. Frowning, Arthur grabbed a shovel. He began to dig at the compacted layer of dirt, centuries-old hay, and sheep dung. After clearing away about 4 inches of grime, the blade of his shovel scraped against wood. He fetched a wire brush and furiously scrubbed the area. It wasn't just rough-hewn barn timber. It was polished, tight-fitting, wide plank oak wood, far too expensive and refined to be buried under the dirt floor of an agricultural barn. Adrenaline began to push through his exhaustion. He expanded his clearing, uncovering a perfect square of this oak flooring, about 6 feet by 6 feet. Arthur wedged his pry bar into a seam between 2 of the thick oak planks and threw his entire body weight onto it. With a deafening crack, the rusted nails gave way. He ripped the plank up and tossed it aside. He repeated the process, tearing up the beautiful oak boards one by one, tossing them into the mud. When he cleared the wood, he stopped dead in his tracks, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Beneath the oak was a solid slab of poured concrete. Arthur stared at it, his mind racing. The barn was built in the 1880s. Concrete wasn't commonly used in rural farm structures until decades later. And nobody pours a perfect concrete slab just to bury it under expensive oak and 4 inches of dirt. This was deliberate. This was a concealment. He frantically cleared the edges of the slab until he found what he was looking for. In the center of the concrete was a recessed hollow containing a heavy, rusted iron ring. Arthur grasped the ring with both hands and pulled. The veins in his neck bulged, but the slab didn't budge a millimeter. It must have weighed 1,000 pounds. Refusing to be defeated, Arthur ran out into the driving rain to his truck. He backed it up to the barn doors and unwound the heavy steel cable from the winch on his front bumper. Dragging the cable through the mud, he hooked it securely onto the iron ring. He ran back to the cab of the truck and engaged the winch. The engine strained, the cable snapping taut with a terrifying twang. For an agonizing moment, nothing happened. The truck's tires spun slightly in the mud. Then, with a horrific grinding shriek of concrete dragging against stone, the massive slab began to lift and slide backward. Arthur killed the engine and grabbed his heavy-duty maglite. He walked back into the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Where the slab had been, there was now a pitch-black square hole. A rush of stale, incredibly cold air wafted up from the darkness, carrying the faint, metallic scent of rust and old paper. Arthur shone his flashlight down into the abyss. A narrow, sharply descending staircase made of poured concrete led down into the earth. He didn't hesitate. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Arthur slowly descended. 10 steps, 20, 30. He was going deep beneath the foundation of the barn. At the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight beam swept across a surprisingly large subterranean room. The walls were lined with expensive glazed brick, an astonishing architectural feat to find buried beneath a farm. Arthur's first thought was that he had found a Prohibition-era bootlegger's stash. The 1920s were a wild time in Vermont, with smugglers running liquor down from the Canadian border. And sure enough, scattered across the floor were dozens of smashed wooden crates and shattered glass bottles. He walked further into the room, his boots crunching on the glass. Disappointment began to wash over him. The crates had all been violently pried open. Whatever had been stored down here had been looted decades ago. He picked up a fragment of a wooden crate. It wasn't stamped with a liquor brand. It bore a faded, stenciled insignia. Property of the U.S. Federal Reserve, District 1. Arthur dropped the wood, a cold chill running down his spine. Why would a Federal Reserve crate be hidden in a barn in Oakhaven? As he swept his flashlight around the perimeter, searching for clues, the beam caught something resting on a small, rusted metal table in the corner. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, covered in a thick layer of white dust. Arthur blew the dust off, coughing as it clouded the air. He carefully opened the brittle, yellowed pages. The ink was faded, but legible. It wasn't a list of farm inventory. It was a ledger of payouts, dates, and account numbers dating back to 1932. And the names beside the staggering sums of money made Arthur's blood run cold. Alden Lawson, $50,000. Thomas Henderson, Femogtuve, null. These weren't random names. These were the grandfathers of Richard Lawson and Bill Henderson, the founding fathers of Oakhaven, the men who had built the town's wealth. Suddenly, a strange sensation caught Arthur's attention. The air down here was entirely stagnant, yet he felt a distinct, icy draft brushing against the back of his neck. He turned around, tracking the source of the air. It was coming from behind a massive, rusted, cast-iron boiler pushed against the far wall. Arthur squeezed past the boiler. Behind it, the glazed brick wall looked different. The mortar was crumbling, hastily applied, and the bricks were slightly misaligned. It was a false wall. Using the handle of his flashlight, Arthur struck the center brick. The mortar cracked and crumbled effortlessly. He struck it again, and the brick slid backward into a dark void. Arthur pulled out the brick, then another, and another, widening the hole until it was large enough to look through. He aimed his flashlight through the breach into the hidden chamber beyond. The beam of light cut through the absolute darkness, striking something metallic. Arthur gasped, stumbling backward against the iron boiler. There, stacked meticulously from floor to ceiling, was a sight that defied logic, reason, and everything he thought he knew about the sleepy town of Oakhaven. Arthur tore away the remaining false bricks with frantic, bleeding hands. The opening was now wide enough for him to squeeze his shoulders through. He aimed his heavy-duty maglite into the hidden chamber, coughing as the stagnant air of nearly a century rushed out to meet him. The secret room was smaller than the antechamber, heavily reinforced with steel beams. But it wasn't the architecture that made Arthur's knees weak. Stacked methodically against the far wall were dozens of zinc-lined military surplus crates. Several of the lids had rotted away, revealing their contents. They were filled to the brim with tight, pristine bundles of paper. Arthur stepped into the room, his boots kicking up clouds of ancient dust. He approached the nearest crate, holstering his flashlight under his arm to free his trembling hands. He reached down and pulled a bundle free. It was wrapped in a brittle paper band stamped with the seal of the United States Treasury. He held the bundle to the light. The bills were impossibly crisp, bearing the portrait of Salmon P. Chase. Arthur's heart stopped. As a retired history teacher, he knew exactly what he was holding. These were Series 1,928 $10,000 gold certificates. They were never meant for public circulation. They were used exclusively for transactions between Federal Reserve banks. And staring at the crate before him, he was looking at hundreds of them. Millions of dollars in Depression-era currency, perfectly preserved. Next to the crates of currency sat a heavy, velvet-lined wooden box. Arthur pried the rusted latch open to reveal two solid steel printing plates, gleaming menacingly in the flashlight beam. The master dies for the gold certificates. Arthur's mind raced, piecing together a forgotten puzzle of American history. In 1932, a heavily armored Federal Reserve rail car traveling from Boston to New York was mysteriously derailed and robbed. It was one of the largest unsolved heists of the Great Depression. The authorities never found the culprits, the plates, or the money. The ledger in the other room suddenly made horrific sense. Elias Cobb hadn't just been a farmer. He was the mastermind. And the founding fathers of Oakhaven, the grandfathers of Richard Lawson and Bill Henderson, were his accomplices. The massive wealth that built this town, the money that funded Lawson's real estate empire and the local businesses, was all blood money paid out from a historic federal robbery. It truly is a breathtaking sight, isn't it, Arthur? The voice echoed from the darkness behind him, smooth, cold, and dripping with menace. Arthur whipped around, dropping the bundle of cash. Standing in the breached doorway of the false wall was Richard Lawson. He was wearing a heavy, water-resistant trench coat, thoroughly soaked from the rain. Beside him stood Sheriff Dale Miller, the local head of law enforcement, his hand resting casually on the butt of his service weapon. "Lawson," Arthur breathed, stepping backward until his spine hit the stacks of crates. "How did you?" "You left your generator running and your truck doors wide open, Davies," Lawson said, stepping into the hidden vault. His eyes greedily scanned the zinc-lined crates, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "I've been keeping an eye on this property ever since you refused to sell. When I saw the lights shining up from the ground, I made a quick phone call to Dale here. Figured you might need some local assistance." Sheriff Miller stepped into the room, his face an unreadable mask. "You're trespassing on a restricted historical site, Mr. Davies." "Trespassing? I own this land," Arthur shot back, his voice rising in panic. "And I know what this is. This is the 1932 Boston railcar heist. Your grandfathers pulled it off. This whole town is built on stolen federal money." Lawson chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "My grandfather, Alden, was a pragmatist. Elias Cobb was a paranoid lunatic. Cobb masterminded the hit, sure, but he got greedy. He gave my grandfather and the others their shares to keep them quiet, but he hoarded the main prize down here. Then the old fool went and caught pneumonia and died before he could tell anyone how to access the vault. We knew it was under the property somewhere, but we couldn't just bulldoze the land without drawing federal attention. We had to wait. We had to buy it legally. And then you showed up," Sheriff Miller spat, glaring at Arthur. "Some grieving out-of-towner throwing around his dead wife's insurance money, outbidding the one man who actually knew what this land was worth." "You can't keep this a secret," Arthur said, his eyes darting between the two men. "The FBI will investigate the serial numbers on this money." "The FBI isn't going to investigate a tragic accident, Arthur," Lawson interrupted smoothly. He nodded to the sheriff. Miller unclipped the retaining strap on his holster and slowly drew his heavy Glock, pointing it directly at Arthur's chest. "Old barns collapse all the time," Lawson continued, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper, "especially during terrible autumn storms. The roof caves in, a fire breaks out from a faulty generator. A tragic end for the fool of Oakhaven. By the time the ashes cool, Dale and I will have relocated this inventory, and I'll buy the charred remains of this lot at the municipal foreclosure auction for pennies." Arthur stared at the barrel of the gun. His chest tightened. They were going to bury him down here with the ghosts of 1932. He thought of Helen. He thought of his sister, Margaret, pleading with him to come home. He hadn't survived the soul-crushing grief of losing his wife just to be executed in a muddy basement by a pair of small-town tyrants. He needed a distraction. He needed a miracle. Arthur's eyes flicked to the heavy maglite, still gripped in his right hand. He had the tactical advantage of knowing the layout of the antechamber behind Lawson, specifically the massive, rusted iron boiler he had squeezed past to get here. "You're right, Richard," Arthur said, his voice remarkably steady. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm just a history teacher. I don't want any trouble. Take it. Take all of it." "Glad you see reason, Artie," Sheriff Miller sneered, lowering the gun by a fraction of an inch. Now, with a violent flick of his wrist, Arthur hurled the heavy metal maglite directly at Sheriff Miller's face. At the same time, he kicked the velvet box containing the heavy steel printing plates into Lawson's shins. The heavy flashlight struck the sheriff squarely in the bridge of the nose with a sickening crack. Miller screamed, dropping his weapon as he clutched his bleeding face. Lawson stumbled backward, tripping over the heavy printing plates and crashing into the brick wall. Arthur didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, plunging into the absolute darkness of the antechamber. He sprinted blindly, his memory guiding him. He bumped hard into the rusted iron boiler, using it to violently propel himself toward the concrete staircase. "Shoot him! Shoot him!" Lawson roared from the vault, his voice echoing off the glazed bricks. A gunshot deafened the underground room. The bullet sparked off the metal boiler, missing Arthur by inches. Arthur hit the concrete stairs on all fours, scrambling upward like a wild animal. Rain lashed against his face as he broke the surface, tumbling out onto the muddy floor of the barn. Below him, he could hear the heavy boots of Lawson and the sheriff hitting the concrete stairs. He had seconds. Arthur sprinted to the front of his truck. The heavy steel winch cable was still taut, holding the massive 1,000-pound concrete slab open on an upward incline. He threw open the driver's side door and grabbed the winch control remote sitting on the front seat. As Lawson's head crowned the top of the subterranean staircase, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage, Arthur slammed his thumb down on the release button. The mechanical gears of the winch shrieked as they disengaged. The tension on the steel cable snapped. Gravity took over instantly. The 1,000-pound concrete slab, slick with rain and mud, violently slid back down its sloped track. Lawson barely had time to scream before the slab slammed shut with an earth-shattering boom, locking perfectly back into its recess. The sheer force of the impact severed the steel cable, sending the frayed end whipping through the air. Silence descended on the barn, save for the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the roof. Arthur stood frozen, panting heavily, clutching the winch remote. Beneath his feet, he could feel faint, muffled thuds against the concrete slab. They were trapped. Arthur scrambled into his truck, threw it in reverse, and tore out of the Cobb estate. He didn't stop in Oakhaven. He didn't trust anyone in the town. He drove wildly through the storm for 2 hours until he reached the regional FBI field office in Albany, New York. When Arthur walked into the federal building, covered in mud, grease, and holding a single Series 1,928 $10,000 gold certificate, the agents on duty stopped dead in their tracks. The resulting fallout was the biggest news story of the decade. By dawn, a convoy of black tactical vehicles and federal agents had descended upon Oakhaven. They excavated the barn, lifting the slab to find a terrified Richard Lawson and Sheriff Miller waiting in the darkness. Both men were arrested immediately on federal charges of attempted murder, corruption, and possession of stolen government property. The subsequent investigation tore the town's hierarchy apart. The ledger, Arthur found, was the smoking gun the Treasury Department had been searching for since 1932. Federal prosecutors seized Lawson's entire real estate empire, proving it had been built entirely on laundered, stolen funds. Bill Henderson's hardware store and several other historic businesses were heavily audited and ultimately seized. The legacy of Oakhaven's founding fathers was reduced to a criminal syndicate. As for Arthur Davies, he went from the fool of Oakhaven to a national celebrity overnight. Because the stolen currency consisted of extremely rare gold certificates and printing plates, the historical value far exceeded the face value. The Treasury Department, adhering to a little-known antiquities recovery law, awarded Arthur a staggering multi-million-dollar finder's fee for the recovery of the federal assets and the plates. 2 years later, the Cobb estate was unrecognizable. Arthur used his reward money to fully restore the barn. He hired top-tier structural engineers and master carpenters to transform the dilapidated structure into a breathtaking, state-of-the-art residential home and historical museum. The original wide-plank oak floors were polished to a mirror shine, and a glass floor section was installed over the restored subterranean vault, allowing visitors to look down into the very room where the town's darkest secret had slept for nearly a century. Arthur stood on the balcony of his newly finished home, sipping his morning coffee and looking out over the rolling Vermont hills. He wasn't the town fool anymore. He had healed his grief not by forgetting